Guys, my name's Mr. Lead, and today we're going to be talking about machines. Now, when we talk about machines, when you think of machines, you probably think of complex machines like an iPhone and like a big crane or things like that. But what if I told you that this right here, this door stopper, is a machine? Or what if I told you this nail here is an example of a machine? These are examples of what's known as simple machines. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today, simple machines. So what you got to understand is that most machines, whether it be, say, a Nerf gun or a microscope or whatever, most machines at least feature one or more of these 6 basic simple machines: the lever, inclined plane, wedge, pulley, wheel and axle, and screw. Now, to understand why these count as machines, we need to think about the forces involved. So a machine is a device that makes a certain task easier. It will either change the size of a force or make something speed up. It will either be a force multiplier or a speed multiplier. So a simple machine is something that does that does only one of these two things. To better understand what a force multiplier is, you can think of, say, a hammer. When you're trying to pull a nail out of a block of wood, it's much easier to do that with the hammer because the hammer is multiplying the force that you're using. A speed multiplier, on the other hand, isn't multiplying the force, it's multiplying the speed you're using. So say, for example, an egg beater. If you're turning the handle of an egg beater, the beaters are spinning much, much faster than the way you turn the handle. That's a speed multiplier. So a simple machine is something that does either one of these things. It will facilitate only one of these two things. We've got to keep this in mind as we understand what simple machines are. So some other terms to know. A simple machine, with regards to simple machines, you can have an effort. That is a force that you apply to the machine. And then you've also got the load. So that's the resistance to the applied force. And sometimes that can actually be an object that the force is applied to. So to better understand this, we got an example of a simple machine here. This is a lever. It's like a little seesaw. We have a load on the one side of the seesaw, and this guy here is applying effort to the seesaw. So the force he applies is the effort, and the block on the other end is the load. Now, another term to know is mechanical advantage. A simple machine needs to give some sort of mechanical advantage. So what I mean by that, it needs to make it easier to do something with the machine. So the difference between the difference in the speed or the force with and without the machine needs to be present. So, for example, if this guy was to pick up the load without the machine, it takes 400 newtons of force, applied force, to pick up that load, and that's the same amount of force that gravity is pulling on the object. But with the machine, he doesn't need to apply as much force. There is a mechanical advantage. This guy, so with this formula here, load divided by effort, we can work out that the mechanical advantage this machine gives is 10. It is 10 times easier to pick up this load with the machine. That's what machines do. They give some sort of mechanical advantage. Now, this can be a force advantage or a speed advantage. To better understand these two terms, we got to remember that simple machines can either be force multipliers or speed multipliers. So a force multiplier will give a force advantage. It will mean that it's easier to lift a big load or carry out a task that requires a lot of force with a little force. The machine facilitates that. But a speed advantage means that it's not actually making it require less force. In fact, you actually have to exert more force. But with the machine, the more force you exert, the faster the task gets carried out. So, for example, if this guy wanted to fly this load up in the air, it's easy to just throw it up in the air, but it's actually even easier if he just applies more force to this machine so that this load gets flung up into the air. That's a speed advantage. You're applying more force to a small load, and you're applying that quickly. Okay, so we're going to dissect these two terms, force advantage, speed advantage, as we look at each of the different types of simple machines. Starting with, what might be, oh, here we go, what might be the most basic simple machine? The inclined plane. That's right, even an inclined plane, even a ramp counts as a machine. Because if you think about it, it's actually easier to push an object up a ramp as opposed to lifting up an object and putting it on top of a surface. So that's why an inclined plane is a force multiplier. Now, you got to remember, like other force multipliers, for the amount of work doesn't actually change with a force multiplier. So it would require a lot of work to lift up that load and put it onto, say, a van or something like that. But with the ramp, the amount of work doesn't change. The amount of force and time changes. So instead of being quick and using a lot of force, you're actually being slow but using less force. Okay, the amount of work doesn't change, but the force does. Now, something to note with ramps, you can actually have a shortcut way of calculating the ideal mechanical advantage. And I say ideal because you can, if you take into consideration like the friction and surface of a ramp, this formula doesn't count. But you can work out the ideal mechanical advantage with height and ramp distance. Ramp distance divided by height. That's just a quick shortcut way of, instead of doing the standard load divided by effort. Anyway, moving on to the next simple machine, the screw. A screw also gives a force advantage. Now, what's to note about screws? Screws aren't just good for holding things in place. They can actually elevate things. Hang on. Oh, there we go. Just had to get the animations working. So yeah, a screw can actually be used to elevate things, not just fasten things in place. So a prime example is, this is the Archimedes screw. Well, you can see that this screw is actually being used to lift water from one plane to a higher plane. A jack also works in the same way. You can use a jack to raise up your car and do repairs and things like that. When you actually think about it, a screw is actually just a spiraling inclined plane. So yeah, that actually means that yes, some simple machines can actually be made of other simple machines. But we're still sticking with these same six. So I'm not actually going to talk too much about screws, but instead we'll move on to the next simple machine, the wedge. Now, a wedge also provides a force advantage, but it does something different to the inclined plane and the screw. Wedges not only provide a force advantage, they also change the direction of a force. What I mean by that, if you look at the way this force is being applied, so if you just took a hammer and you whacked it at a piece of wood, the direction of the force is just going down. With a wedge, the direction is now being divided and going in opposite directions. It is now dividing that force and using that force to split something. Now, wedges are used a lot more often than you probably think. A fork counts as a wedge. A nail counts as a wedge. That was the example from before. The door stopper is a wedge. That can be used to fasten things, not just to split something apart. Like the inclined plane, a wedge also has a shortcut way of calculating the mechanical advantage. That's wedge height divided by wedge width. So if you've got a longer, pointier wedge, that will have a higher mechanical advantage. It will be a greater force multiplier than a wedge that is much more blunt, much more lower and wider. All right, the next simple machine, pulleys. So a pulley is also a force multiplier, but it only counts as a force multiplier if you've got two or more pulleys, okay? If you've only got one pulley, that just changes the direction of the force. So we see, for the example, we have this this person here. He's thrown a rope over this branch, and then boom, he's just created a pulley. But because it's only one pulley, he has to apply the same amount of force he would normally have to apply to pick up this bucket of water. Now, a bucket of water doesn't take a lot of force. Let's think about it with this person lifting this crate. That's actually a really hard task with one pulley. He may as well just try lifting the crate with his own hands. There is no mechanical advantage with one pulley. When you have two or more pulleys, that is when you start to get a force advantage. That is when, it makes it easier to lift things up. Okay, Next one. Now we're starting to get into some of the more trickier simple machines. The wheel and axle. Now note this is not just a wheel. You have to have a wheel and an axle. Now, wheel and axles can actually be force multipliers or a speed multiplier. Now you're probably much more familiar with wheel and axles as in this version. A wheel and axle as a speed multiplier, because that's the wheels that we have on our cars. Our car wheels are speed multipliers. So with a wheel and axle, you can either twist from the axle or twist from the wheel. If you twist from the axle, that little twist is causing a big turn for the wheel. It's making the wheel that wheel is gonna go around faster at a faster rate. So that's a speed advantage. But if you twist from the wheel, that's going to give a force advantage. Now, here's some examples of the force advantage uses of wheels. What you got to know with wheel and axles, a wheel and axle doesn't have to be a literal wheel. It just has to be a big circular thing on some sort of shaft. So even a screwdriver counts as a wheel and axle because you've got a big round thing on a shaft. That's a wheel and axle. And you're twisting from the wheel, which means you're creating a force multiplier. It's much easier to twist a screw with that screwdriver. That's a force multiplier. Your steering wheel is an example of a force multiplier. Okay, so wheels can be either force multipliers or speed multipliers depending on how you use them. All right, the last simple machine is the lever. This is actually the one that confuses a lot of people, probably the most. There are 3 types of levers depending on the way you use them. Now, what's firstly confusing about levers is people think levers are just that sort of switch on a control panel. That's not the only thing. That's not the only way we define levers. A lever is just some sort of shaft, some sort of stick that has a fulcrum, a load, and an effort. The fulcrum is the point at which that stick is turning from. The load and the effort, well, we've already talked about those. So levers can be, and there are 3 types of levers, and that depends on what is in the middle. A first-class lever has a fulcrum in the middle, and so that's like a seesaw. So it's got, and with the fulcrum in the middle, you can have the load and effort on either side, and it can be a force multiplier or a speed multiplier depending on where the fulcrum is positioned. A second-class lever has the fulcrum on the end and the load in the middle. That's kind of like a wheelbarrow. When you're lifting up that wheelbarrow, the load's in the middle, and so as soon as you drop it, because the load's there, it's just going to go straight back down. So that's a second-class lever, load in the middle, fulcrum on the end. Third-class lever is where you have fulcrum on the end and the effort in the middle. Now, this one's the most tricky one to understand. What you've got to realize with this is that a second-class lever and third-class lever, they don't act like seesaws because the fulcrum is on the end. The fulcrum is just the point at which that lever is turning from. So a baseball bat is an example of a third-class lever because you are holding the baseball bat at a certain point. No, it's turning actually from the handle. You're holding it just above that handle, and you're applying effort just above that handle, just above the turning point, and you're hitting a ball, you're hitting a load. That's a speed advantage because it's only good for a baseball bat's only good for hitting a small effort really fast. It's going to make that ball go very fast and fly. So think of a baseball bat when you're thinking of speed multipliers. You're moving a small load quickly with a large effort. On the other side, force multipliers like this wheelbarrow, you're moving a large load slowly with a small effort. It's much easier to lift something in wheelbarrow than it is to actually pick it up in real life, but it takes time to lift that thing and move that thing. Now, one last thing I'll mention about levers is because people forget which are first, second, third class all the time. An easy way to remember is with FLEE. FLEE is an acronym that stands for fulcrum, load, and effort, and it tells us which one is in the middle. For the first class lever, fulcrum's in the middle. Second class lever, load's in the middle. Third class lever, effort's in the middle. Remember FLEE. Okay, this has been a bit of an information overload, but the last thing we're going to talk about is gears. Now, gears are not another simple machine. We've already talked about the 6 simple machines, but people usually classify gears as the unofficial 7th simple machine because it's such a simple mechanism. But the reason why it's not really a simple machine is because they're basically just wheel and axles with levers. But with all that aside, we're still going to look at what gears are. Gears can also be either force multipliers or speed multipliers. Now, this all depends once again on how they're used. Just like how wheel and axles can be force or speed multipliers depending on how they're used. So, the thing to note about gears: one gear by itself means nothing. You need at least 2 gears to have an effect. Okay. And when you put 2 gears together, one of those gears is going to become the driving gear, and the other gear is going to become the driven gear. What I mean by that is, one of those gears you're going to turn, that's the driving gear, you are driving that gear. The other gears are going to follow suit. They're going to be turning in response. They're the driven gears. They're being driven by the driving gear. So in this example here, if you turn this gear will follow suit. It's being driven, this is the driving gear. Now, when we think about whether gears are force multipliers or speed multipliers, that all depends on the size of the gears. Now, if a gear is smaller, if the driving gear is smaller, then it's going to be a force multiplier. So think of it this way: if you've got a massive gear and you want to turn that gear somehow, you need a tiny little gear to be able to turn that, because it takes too much force to turn that massive gear on its own. So instead you use a little gear and you turn that a whole lot of times because it requires less force, but does require more time to turn the big gear. But if you want to get a speed advantage, your driving gear needs to be bigger. So if the driving gear is bigger than the driven gear, then the driven gear is going to go faster. So we see here, this big gear is the driving gear. We are turning this gear, and in response, this little gear has to keep up, and it's turning really fast. There is a speed advantage here. We are speeding up the little gear here, but it's actually requiring more force to speed it up because it takes more force to turn this giant gear here. 3 other quick things to note about gears. Firstly, you can calculate the mechanical advantage with the gear ratio. We count the number of teeth a gear has, so that's these little spikes. The number of teeth on the driven gear divided by the number of teeth on the driving gear gets you the mechanical advantage. We can also represent the gear ratio as an actual ratio with a colon in between, and that shows the effectiveness of gears. Second thing to note about gears: they change direction of a force, but if you want to keep the direction going the same way, if you want the driving gear to be the same way as the driven gear, either put a gear in between, that's called an idler gear, or use a chain, just like a bicycle. And the third thing, if you want gears to go on right angles, use bevel gears. So that's what you got to know about gears. So with all that being said, if you really start to understand simple machines and you understand each type of simple machine, you're going to notice that there are simple machines everywhere around us. Most common objects actually combine multiple simple machines, such as these scissors. They combine wedges and first-class levers. And down here, we got a wedge and a third-class lever. And when you start combining simple machines, you get machines that have both a force advantage and a speed advantage. So that's what, like this axe here, because it's got a simple machine that gives a speed advantage, that's the third-class lever, and we've got a simple machine that gives a force advantage, that's the wedge. You get the best of both worlds. It's combining the force advantage and speed advantage of these. So when you start to understand simple machines, and if you've already understood forces, you get to understand how mechanisms and how like the machines that we rely on for society, how they all work and how we can benefit from them. Thanks for watching, guys.